Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, everyone, wherever and whenever this may find you. My name is Ayça Çubukçu. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Sociology and co-director of LSE Human Rights at the London School of Economics and Political Science. It is a pleasure to welcome you to our annual Human Rights Day lecture at LSE or through LSE and introduce our speaker today, Professor Seyla Benhabib. Before we proceed, allow me to extend warm thanks to Mehdi Giles of the Department of Sociology and the whole LSE events team for all their work in making this conversation possible. Today, we're honored and thrilled to host Professor Benhabib for our Human Rights Day lecture, which, as many of you will remember, was delivered by Professor Anthony Engi last academic year. Professor Benhabib's work will require no introduction for anyone concerned with critical theory in and beyond the field of political philosophy. Nevertheless, let me say a few words about her remarkably productive tenure as a political theorist. Professor Benhabib is currently Professor Emerita at Yale University since June 2020, and she now teaches at the Columbia Law School as a Senior Research Fellow and Professor of Law Adjunct with an affiliation in the Philosophy Department. Professor Benhabib's books include Critique, Norm, and Utopia, a study of the four normative foundations of critical theory, which was published in 1986, Situating the Self, Gender, Community, and Postmodernism in Contemporary Ethics, published in 1992, her book with Judith Butler, Drusilla Cornell, and Nancy Fraser, Feminist Contentions, A Philosophical Exchange, published in 94, The Reluctant Modernism of Hannah Arendt, published in 96 and reissued in 2002, which is my go-to book whenever I feel conflicted about Arendt's contradictions. The Claims of Culture, Equality and Diversity in the Global Era, published in 2002. The Rise of Others, Aliens, Citizens and Residents, 2004. Another Cosmopolitanism, Hospitality, Sovereignty, and Democratic Iterations, with responses by Jeremy Waldron, Bonnie Honig, and Will Kymlicka in 2006. Dignity in Adversity, Human Rights in Troubled Times, 2011. Equality and Difference, Human Dignity and Popular Sovereignty in the Mirror of Political Modernity, 2013. And Exile, Statelessness, and Migration, Playing Chess with History from Hannah Arendt to Isaiah Berlin in 2018. Professor Benhabib has also edited some 8 volumes addressing themes ranging from discussions of communicative ethics to democracy and difference to identities, allegiances, and affinities. One of these volumes, the highly acclaimed Migrations and Mobilities, Gender, Borders, and Citizenship, which she edited with Judith Resnick, was named a Choice Outstanding Book. Since we will be talking about cosmopolitanism today, allow me to also observe that among other languages, Professor Benhabib's scholarship has been translated into German, Spanish, French, Italian, Turkish, Swedish, Russian, Serbo-Croatian, Hebrew, Japanese, Chinese, Portuguese, and Persian. I could go on and on about her accomplishments, all the honorary degrees, the editorship, but I want to leave as much time as possible for the rare chance we have to have this discussion with Professor Benhabib. Her lecture, the title of our Human Rights Day lecture this year is The End of the 1951 Refugee Convention with a question mark, which draws on an article Professor Benhabib has published earlier this year. So we will today, let me remind everyone that this event is being audio recorded and broadcasted live over social media. So if you want to watch what you say, please watch what you say. And barring technical difficulties, we will soon make the recording available as a video on YouTube and also as a podcast on LSE's website. For Twitter users in the audience, the hashtag for today's event is hashtag LSE Human Rights Day. After Professor Benhabib's lecture, which will last for about 45 minutes, I will pose her a few questions before I open up the floor to the audience towards a collective discussion, which will last for another 45 minutes or so. And audience members could use the Q&A function on Zoom or Facebook comments to pose their questions, and I will voice the questions for Professor Benhabib. Normally, we would then move towards a reception and a dinner, but given our new norms under COVID-19, that will have to wait for another time. So without further ado, and with much anticipation, please join me in welcoming Professor Seyla Benhabib to deliver our annual Human Rights Day lecture this year. Thank you very much, Professor Benhabib. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Ayça, for this generous and kind introduction. Thank you to the LSE for inviting me to deliver the Human Rights Lecture this year. It's a real pleasure and an honor, and thank you to the Department of Sociology for hosting and making this event possible. I will share my screen with you, and so if you will permit me, just give me a second to start the slideshow, and for some reason I'm having, here we are. There we go. Okay. As we all know, the plight of the refugees, sometimes referred to as the refugee crisis of our times, has dominated media in many parts of the world for the last 2 decades. And one of the last events, of course, which shocked our consciences with the world is this fire at the refugee camp in Moria, Greece, this September. These images could be reproduced, but today what I would like to do is I would like to address the broader issues and currents that are hidden behind this term, quote unquote, the refugee crisis. And I will look at the main legal document that governs what I'd like to call the transnational movement of people across borders. And then I'd like to set this legal document also against the background of broader developments, which I shall name territorialization and de-territorialization, but a number of terminological clarifications before I begin. We use the term refugee to refer to an aggregate group, but according to the more technical terminology used by legal practitioners, scholars in the field, etc., it's more appropriate to talk about forcibly displaced persons worldwide. Indeed, this is the highest number of people we have seen. According to UNHCR numbers, we have 70 million forcibly displaced people worldwide. only close to 26 million are refugees, because official definitions refer to refugees as those who cross international borders. There are 14.3 million internally displaced peoples. Just to try to concretize this for you, we know that the Rohingya within Myanmar itself will be internally displaced, but when they cross the border to Bangladesh, they would be referred to as refugees. 5.5 million people stand under UN protection. This is the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine since 1948 and 1968 wars. Now, there are some new trends that arise as a consequence of worldwide developments in technology and economics, which I will go into greater detail in a second. Let me just use the subheadings territorialization, deterritorialization to refer to that, which I will define. But I want to say, in the domain of transnational movements, whether for migratory purposes or refuge and asylum seeking purposes, right? And these are distinct. What we are seeing is a phenomenon called crim migration. That is criminalization of migration. And this criminalization of migration applies both to refugees and also to ordinary migrants. And I think these developments are true both for the European Union, the United States, Australia, etc. The second aspect of this new trend is privatization. That is increasingly the outsourcing by state actors of their responsibilities to private actors, be it in the domain of airport controls, visa controls, or more reprehensibly, as we will see in a second, be it the use of private forces to intercept refugee movements and prevent them from reaching the territory where they wish to claim asylum. A third trend is securitization. Along with crim migration and privatization, there is the emergence of security agencies and measures. Again, these are quite common both to the European Union with the rise of Frontex and to the United States, as I shall discuss in a second, with the developments going on in the US-Mexico border. So these sociological, technological transformations are taking place within a context of a normative state order. So I'm going to try to move along two axes in this lecture. I will both look at larger social developments, socioeconomic developments, but I'll also look much more closely than is usually done at the legal documents that govern intrastate behavior. I'd like to say that the world order that we are currently inhabiting is a dualistic one. On the one hand, we have the principle of territorially circumscribed state sovereignty, which is one of the pillars of the international order. And on the other hand, we have the increasing development and expansion of a domain of international human rights and conventions. Since 1948, an increasing extension of multilateral human rights and covenants, the most well-known of which the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, Convention on the Elimination against all discrimination against women, etc., etc. And I'd like to say, without much detail right now, what we are also experiencing is the so-called tense relationship between these covenants and state commitments and the notion of territorially circumscribed state sovereignty. This requires some elucidation further on. Now, by deterritorialization, I'm referring to a well-known phenomenon, much acknowledged by social scientists. And this is, of course, the rise of a world economy, or rather the development of a world economy to what is often referred to as a form of neoliberal financial globalization. Okay? Again, for my purposes, the important thing is that here, neoliberal financial globalization also requires the emergence of transnational and translegal processes and instruments that make the functioning of this economy possible. And we all know that this huge transformation has also been greatly enabled by the development of the World Wide Web and the new technologies in social media and in other domains. In fact, neoliberal financial globalization and the World Wide Web and means of communication go together and interact with one another. So deterritorialization basically means that the movement of capital, news, goods, entertainment, viruses, microbes, everything moves across state borders and at an increasingly fast pace that defy the capacities of very often of state control. And to use Saskia Sassen's famous word, again, this generates the impression, quote unquote, of losing control. But the paradox in this situation, in this expansion of deterritorialization, is that the human body is a body in place. The human person is embodied. The human person hasn't yet been disintegrated into electronic signs, although we're talking enacted, but there is a physicality, there is still the materiality of the human body and the person. So this generates the odd situation that at a point when, as a consequence of deterritorialization, states have lost control of much movement across their boundaries, the human body becomes the site on which the control of the state is exercised. And this is one of the, I think, sad paradoxes of migratory and refugee movements of our time, that if you wish, the whole power and force of the state comes bearing upon individual movement. Now, how is this normatively regulated? How is this possible? What makes this this order act the way it does? Okay. And here we have to look at the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees. This convention is formulated with the memory of 2 world wars, the Holocaust and genocide, and it is one of the most important and foundational human rights documents of the post-war period. And of course, the title of my lecture, with a question mark at the end, is an invitation for us to think about the implications of our commitment to this convention. It was adopted in July 28, 1951, and entered into force in April 22nd, 1954. And there is a 1967 protocol. The important thing about the 1967 protocol is that it tried to eliminate the time and space limits that restricted the status of refugees to a phenomenon occurring in Europe before 1951. This is a very important and somewhat neglected point, that the Refugee Convention defines the refugee as a person who, as a result of events occurring before in Europe before 1951, and owing to well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular group, or political opinion, is outside the country of his nationality, or is unable or unwilling, owing to a well-grounded fear, to avail himself of the protection of that country. Now, important to keep in mind, let's look at every aspect of this definition. The 1961 protocol universalizes the definition of a convention refugee. A convention refugee is no longer a person engaging in flight as a consequence of events occurring in Europe and before 1951. So what we have with the implementation of the protocol, we have a universalization, or if you wish, a globalization of the refugee definition. But I want to talk about 2 major issues in the Refugee Convention, and try to illustrate the way in which this is affecting many of the events that we see around one. And we receive this as the public as news, but we may not quite know why it is that these are happening the way they are, why this is. So the first issue that I want to address is difficulties in doctrinal interpretation and application. And the second is the question of state behavior. Now, the next slide shows the total number of states that are parties to the 1951 Convention. There are 145 in number. That means that there are roughly less than 50 states world over that are not party to the convention, the most consequential of these being a very large state like India. Okay. Now, there are other states like the United States who are parties to the protocol, but not to the convention. I don't think we need to worry about the legalistic implications of this. But since the 51 convention, there have been a number of regional instruments that have been developed to address what are seen as difficulties and loopholes in the 51 convention. The 51 convention itself has not been revised since the 67 protocol. And if you talk with legal practitioners and international lawyers, they will say to you, We know the problems, but please don't touch them, because we will never achieve this kind of a convention again. But what are the problems? What are the important issues? First, I don't want to scroll back to too many slides here for fear of losing the sequence, but the concept of a well-founded fear. How do you establish well-founded fear? According to UNHCR guidelines, you can talk about subjective fear and objective fear. Subjective fear is the individual psychological state. Objective fear are established by human rights reports, by observers about persecution, human rights violations going on in that country. Different jurisdictions interpret the concept of well-founded fear differently, but the notion of the well-founded fear that it must be proven one way or another leads to this necessity of the refugee who seeks asylum of having, quote unquote, the famous asylum interview and being recognized as an asylee only as a consequence of this interview. And as you can imagine, these interview processes are subject to great legal discussions and also subject to abuses, etc. Now, in recognition of the somewhat narrow refugee definition and the procedure applied, Latin American countries have taken the lead many times to try to broaden the refugee definition. And one of the most important regional instruments is the Cartagena Declaration on Refugees, which is a report of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. It introduces the condition of generalized violence. Again, why is this important? It's important because the 1951 convention, it is said, but maybe I can go back to the slide for just 1 second. It is the 1951 convention names what are called 5 protected groups. Individuals persecuted on the basis of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership of a particular social group. This actually means that there is an enormous burden of proof on the individual and the asylum granting officials to conform, okay, what they are doing to these 5 protected groups, or to say that the procedure of admission to asylum status has come under one of these 5 protected groups. In the last number of years, particularly in the domain of gender and sexual identity-related crimes, there have been developments that have pushed this notion of membership in a particular social group. For example, Canada and the United States now do accept female genital mutilation, individuals escaping female genital mutilation as grounds for refugee status recognition, and increasingly certain forms of arranged marriages, but also the status of gay and trans individuals that is becoming grounds for worldwide persecution. So at the doctrinal level, a lot of development has had to take place under this vague category of membership in a social group. So Latin America is, was one of the first and initiated. Another regional instrument is that governing the specific refugee problems in Africa and This is also important because it applies now the term refugee to every person who, owing to external aggression, occupation, foreign domination, etc., is compelled to leave his habitual place of residence for events seriously disturbing public order. Okay. What implications does the internationalization of the convention have? And by the internationalization, I mean that with the 1967 protocol, the definition of a convention refugee is no longer restricted to events occurring in Europe prior to 1951. Okay. The irony among the many ironies and paradoxes of the situation is that the internationalization of the convention has not meant equitable and worldwide responsibility sharing. Not at all. In fact, despite all the hue and cry of the world's major liberal democracies, it is still the third world and developing countries of the world that have the largest number of refugees among themselves. Turkey, in recent years, has emerged as leading the refugee numbers with 3.5 to 3.7 million Syrian refugees. Pakistan has 1.4, Uganda 1.2, Lebanon close to 1 million, Iran 980,000, Bangladesh undoubtedly also as a consequence of the Rohingya crisis 932,000. Among these countries, only Germany reaches from Europe, comes close with 1.1 million refugees. And I have these figures from the statistical yearbook of the UNHCR, April 2020. Now, I will just mention one more doctrinal issue in the 51 Convention, and then I'll turn to state behavior. What are states doing? How are they handling their obligations? And this is the distinction between economic migrants versus refugees. I think both at an analytical level and at a jurisprudential level, it's very difficult to distinguish between economic deprivation and political persecution. They lead to one another. One sometimes causes the other. You can find the same groups, particularly political persecution leads to economic deprivation. And those who are economically deprived usually have some form of persecution to point to. But nonetheless, we operate with this fiction. We operate, states and the public and the world order operate with the fiction that we can have a legitimate, analytically viable distinction between those who leave the countries to seek economic betterment as opposed to refugees escaping persecution. But again, this is one of the issues that one says, no, don't touch it. We will never get consensus around it. Let me just flag this problem. Okay, so what is really happening on the ground? Yeah? In view of these broad deterritorialization movements and in view of the normative obligations generated by the convention for the signatory states, what is going on? What is going on is that states themselves are contributing to deterritorialization. That is to say, they are pushing away from their territory refugees now through various mechanisms of outsourcing. So outsourcing is not only happening in industry and services and manufacture, but it's also happening in the domain of refugee protection. One of the best known examples of this is the Italian Maritime Guards outsourcing the prevention of migrants from reaching Europe to Libyan security forces. We have all seen the plight of the Aquarius vessel, right? The Aquarius was a vessel that in the summer of 2018 set off from Libya with 629 people on board, many people traveling, minors, pregnant women, etc. It was denied admission to Italy by Matteo Salvini, and the ship was wandering around the Mediterranean for several weeks before it was granted admission to the port of Valencia. The plight of the Aquarius is something that has been repeated for other vessels, and this is a consequence of the fact that in 2015, the Italian Maritime Rescue Coordination Center ceased its activities in Eastern Mediterranean and basically outsourced its save and rescue operations, in particular to the Libyan Coast Guard, excuse me. And since 2014, the Mediterranean has become a sea of death. We've had 14,000 migrant deaths since 2014, and I will not have time to go into it right now, but it's not just that the rescue maritime operations have ceased and these coast guards are operating basically almost like sea pirates, but we also have had instances in the Mediterranean when governments have tried to prevent civil society rescue operations from saving migrants. Another instance of this deterritorialization phenomenon is that airports become the strange spaces. Airports, on the one hand, are spaces, it seems, of non-sovereignty, and at the same time, airports are spaces where there are refugee holding pens, refugee holding domains, Frankfurt Airport, for example, okay? And the airport also becomes the first territory for the one trying to access another territory, that and airlines and become sort of like control agencies, right? This is increasingly, particularly also since the rise of terrorism in the United States 911, it's like the securitization of worldwide travel. Okay. A pretty amazing instance of outsourcing and deterritorialization happened in 2001 when Australia simply excised some parts of its territory. Christmas Islands, the Reef, Coco Islands. Australia simply said it no longer wants to have control over these territories, and anybody who reached, let's say, ships that reached from Malaysia and other places this domain, they literally ended up, you know, in no one's water. Then there was an agreement eventually reached with Papua New Guinea so that maritime arrivals would not land on Australian territory, but would be diverted to the famous Manus Island. This is why, although, you know, we've all read about the jungle, okay? The jungle, that territory on northwest France trying to cross into the United Kingdom, referred to as the jungle by the refugees. Again, this is a space until the French government asserted a responsibility. It was a space of extraterritoriality where no one really wanted to take much responsibility. Now, the most important outsourcing agreement, important in the sense of the implications that it has for Europe, was signed in 2015 between the European Union and Turkey. At the start, this committed Turkey to preventing by force, if necessary, refugees crossing from into the EU, and in return, the UN could settle one refugee under official mandate, whatever. This stopped, and UNHCR has ended its activities in Turkey, and there is still a bit of a hick-hack between the money that the European Union promised to Turkey for its protection of Syrian refugees. But important point here is that Turkey is one of these countries that is signatory to the 1951 Convention, but not to its protocol, which means that refugees reaching Turkey from Afghanistan, Iran, Africa, these are not convention refugees because they do not originate via Europe, okay? So Turkey has its own legislation dealing with Syrian and other refugees. And the question is, of course, whether Turkey's own legislation dealing with refugees is in compliance with the 51 Convention or not. And there is some debate about this. And as you may be able to see here, the flag here is not the flag of the UNHCR, but it is the flag of the Turkish Red Cross. Before slowly coming down to some kind of a conclusion, let me say a few things about the United States. Yeah? The United States has been described, I think this is Michael Ignatieff, as engaging in American exceptionalism mutating into exemptionalism. And what is meant by this is that although the United States has been at the forefront of many international agreements and human rights conventions in the post-war period, it has always claimed a certain exemptionalism for itself. Thus, the US was a high contracting party to the 51 Convention, with many American lawyers engaged in the process of drafting the convention, but it did not accede to the convention, it acceded to the protocol. But another feature of US law is that human rights conventions do not become part of US law until there is congressional accession to it. And this has become increasingly difficult in recent years with an obstructionist Senate and the growth of an isolationist Republican opposition within the US Senate that makes it impossible really to exceed human rights agreements and conventions. So the US Congress did not pass the Refugee Act until 1980, but the Refugee Act did accept the 67 Convention together with the 51 Convention aspects of it. So this is good law. To this day, it is good law in the United States. So what we have in fact seen in recent years is not only criminalization of migration, but we have seen, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many other scholars and practitioners, we have seen gross violations of the 51 Convention. the detention of mothers and children coming from Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador already started in 2014 under President Obama as a consequence of many of the securitization acts that passed after 2001 and never were removed. We have the violation of the Immigration and Nationality Act itself that incorporates the Refugee Act, because we are now seeing increasingly non-refoulement. That is non-refoulement, which is the principle of the Refugee Convention, that if you are a signatory, you have an obligation not to refouler, that has pushed back the refugee applying for asylum. Increasingly, we have asylum seekers pushed over the border to Mexico with physical threats, lies, and other methods. Or we have refugees who are increasingly held as criminals, almost, in immigration and detention centers that have themselves now become part of the growth of the carceral state, which is a multi-million-dollar business, with these detention centers dotting the Mexico and US border in Texas and California. So, conclusion. It's rather a question, a conclusion, okay? Deterritorialization and all these developments I have named above delinks the bond between territory, jurisdiction, and the public, in whose name and with whose authorization law and coercion are exercised. This is the main point I want to emphasize, that for democracies in particular, the law is exercised in the name of the people. Deterritorialization is a process of delinking territory, jurisdiction, and democratic accountability. Violeta Moreno-Lux and Martin Lamberg-Peterson call this distance-creating strategies. These distance-creating strategies undermine democratic accountability by removing, literally and metaphorically, okay? Literally in that you don't see what's being enacted in your name, and metaphorically in the name that the distances created are also themselves part of the social and political imaginary of democratic public. So these distance creating strategies make it harder and harder to exercise democratic accountability over these procedures. So I want to conclude by a quotation from I believe, Nigerian journalist whose work sort of alerted me to the danger of the current situation, not just at the level of refugee crisis, but as she puts it, a pillar of the liberal order is collapsing, but does anyone care? Okay. Around the world, she writes, rich and poor countries alike are pulling up their drawbridges, slashing the number of refugees they are willing to accept, and denying asylum to those who have been admitted in the past. In Africa, Asia, and South America, the mood is much the same. And of course, COVID-19 has only exacerbated this condition. I want to leave you with this question. And I think it is important for us as democratic citizens, world citizens, cosmopolitans, and not, to become aware of the larger trends that are behind the headlines and the news items that we are fed every day all around the world. So what is our responsibility? Should we let the 1951 Refugee Convention go to dust? I'll just stop there.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Benhabib, for a very stimulating lecture. And that final question, do we have any responsibility for preventing this convention going to the dustbin of history? I want to begin by the question that you left us with, and raise the question of who is this we in your imagination that has a responsibility towards refugees. I read the article on which your lecture tonight was based, and this question emerged for me as well when I was reading the article by the same name for the audience members. It was published this summer. I was left with a question over your own imagination of the proper demos that is responsible for the protection of refugees. Is it humanity? Is it global community, international community? Is it particular nation states, demoses that we're talking about? The reason I ask this question is you propose a cosmopolitan agenda, what you call a cosmopolitan interdependence, as distinct from liberal internationalism. And I thought perhaps we could speak a little bit about that distinction and your own imagination of responsibility for the situation, the predicament of refugees. In particular, you said in the article version, what I'm arguing here is not, it's not a plea for a borderless world. And I was hoping you could say a bit more about that. Why not? Why isn't this a plea for a borderless world? I'll start with that.
Yes, thank you, Ayça. These are fundamental questions, and I wanted to, not go into greater detail about the normative implications in this lecture, but they're obviously there. There is now an increasingly narrow construction that some political philosophers, legal analysts are using about responsibility for human rights. And in all of my work in the last 20 years or so, I have been going against this trend. And the narrow construction of human rights is that what sense does it make to speak of human rights unless there is an addressee, specific addressee on whom this is placing a burden of compliance, either omission or commission. Now, human rights are both moral claims and legal claims. Some human rights are more specifically legal claims and arise as a result of the specific agreements, treaties, etc. But human rights in general also, in particular, something like the claim of the refugee to non-refoulement, not being sent back to the territory where they are being persecuted, etc. This is a fundamental human rights claim, which goes back to the principle of hospitality in human culture, exercised very widely cross-culturally. So I want to say that this attempt to narrow the refugee claim to territorial obligations alone, okay? So I Australia do not recognize Coco Islands as part of my territorial jurisdiction, and therefore, if a ship full of refugees from Malaysia comes and sinks, this is not my responsibility. Mm-hmm. Well, there are other legal issues of that. So I am arguing against this, and I am emphasizing the generalized human obligation at a moral level that many human rights claims have. Mm-hmm. So that's been sort of my principal, argument, and what I call an acknowledgement of cosmopolitan interdependence. We are increasingly in a situation in the world where we have interdependence without solidarity. Mm-hmm. And the COVID virus, if you wish, is a kind of brilliant metaphor for how human interdependence and the human causal nexus cannot be interrupted. And yet, we feel ourselves, we don't exercise solidarity. Look, for me, one of the biggest ironies of this was, right? I mean, we had a president talking about the China virus, and yet the first masks that reached me in the United States, in New York, Massachusetts, etc., were produced in China, right? Mm-hmm. So on the one hand, we deny as if we can localize the virus, but on the other hand, our interdependence is such that we are, part of this human. Well, you can't quite call it community, in the sense that we do not have thick enough norms and values that are shared. Some are developing and emerging. So I see my work not descriptively. My work is critical and anticipatory. It has always had this ambition. I try to think for a world that is to come, avenir, because justice is always to come. One of Derrida's, Jacques Derrida's famous phrases, which I subscribe to. And in this context, liberal interdependence, that is democratic liberalism that accepts the power and the normative force of international law, and that sees states as principal actors of the world community, that wishes to respect international law. What's wrong with this picture? There is a great deal with this picture that I can support, but it still analytically rests upon an ontology of containment. The idea is always containment, containing human movement, legalizing, regularizing. So my critique of liberal internationalism, I think first it's sociological critique, social theoretical critique. I just don't buy the picture of society and societal trends that you get at this normative level. It's a frozen picture. I mean, I think that sometimes literary thinkers who talk about borderlands and borderings and who point out the ambivalence of borderings have more of a purchase than normative, philosophers who want to see the border as a static line or boundary to be protected. Borders emerge. Borders interrupt people's lives across borderlands. I mean, the Mexico-US is a borderland, and increasingly, let's say, the Turkish-Syria border has become a borderland. There are many instances of this. North Africa and Eastern Mediterranean, the interdependence of peoples over history and culture. So we can just fixate ourselves on this ontology of containment, and then your final question, okay, if one is willing to go this far in the argument, then why not a world without borders?
Mm-hmm.
I have asked myself this question many times.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that I believe there are two points. We need public accountability. We need public responsibility. And in the absence of worldwide institutions that would bear that public responsibility, okay, a world without borders would not be a world of peaceful, free movement. It would be a chaotic world. It would be a conflictual world.
Mm-hmm.
So either we keep working together and building up more and more viable institutions of international responsibility, along with the UNHCR, which itself has a lot of problems, but maybe something more, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that could really execute international cooperation. And we know that this is, we are at a point of such unbelievable state and national egoism right now, and fear adds to it. My second point, and then I'll stop. I'm sorry, I've gone on for long, because these are crucial parts of my argument, and I'm so glad that you gave me a chance to bring them up. The other question is the relationship between jurisdiction and democratic self-governance. Whether you see cosmopolitanism, it does not mean that we do not respect, that we have to respect that link between jurisdiction and self-governance. I think what cosmopolitanism does, it pushes our imagination towards formulating those jurisdictional units. Cities, right? Cities are centers of cosmopolitan interaction, imagination, regions, and we know there is a wide discussion within the European Union itself about the growing significance of regions, and there is also a lot of good work that about cities. Could mayors live, or rule the world? What was Benjamin Barber's, famous book. So these would be the two reasons why I can't quite imagine a world without any borders.
I have a response to that, but our questions are accumulating. Thank you very much. I mean, if I did have time, I would raise the question of, isn't a transnational democracy possible if you tie so tightly democratic possibility to national jurisdiction? Then I wonder what happens to the fate or possibility or the avenir of a democracy to come beyond the nation state. But I want to turn now to one of the questions about, there's a question, I read it very quickly and now I can't find it, but it was raising the question of rising authoritarianism and xenophobia around the world, and asking for the basis, how can a mobilization for refugee rights be effected within countries such as Brazil, the question asked, where you have this rising xenophobia. One could add Turkey to that mix, and of course the United States. How do you interpret this tension? So would you prefer me to voice a couple of questions, or would you prefer to respond to this one?
I think that as long as we have some time now, we have another 20 minutes.
Yes.
Why don't we just, take questions singly, and maybe I'll try to keep my answers brief, and towards the end, I'd like to hear questions. We can bunch them up. But just one clarification about transnational, democracy. When I established the link between jurisdiction and unit of jurisdiction, as I said, the nation is not the only or even the primary unit of jurisdiction. So transnational democracy can extend. You can have larger or smaller, and so that's the rise of worldwide xenophobia. Look, we are. What happened to my screen here? Sorry about that. Are we still connected? Because all of a sudden I lost you. And
we're connected, but you're not sharing your screen now.
No, I don't want to.
Okay, good.
I don't know the computer. We are going through a period of a kind of neo-fascism. I have avoided that word for many months, but I'm not going to avoid it anymore, just because it doesn't look like, stormtroopers, organized mass parties. It does not mean that what we're going through is not that. We have a frontal attack on the idea of democratic governance. We have a frontal attack on institutions of liberal representations, of freedom of the press, freedom of the universities, freedom of science, basically human rights of opposition and assembly, but also the rise of a kind of white masculinist rhetoric. And Brazil's Bolsonaro, together with Trump, is exemplary of the rise of this homophobic, anti-women, anti-transgender, regressive masculinity that also has a rage against nature. These all makes me think about the old themes of the dialectic of enlightenment, Adorno and Horkheimer, that not only do we repress the nature within, but we also repress the nature outside. So under these circumstances, the refugee becomes the symbolic outsider that threatens this mythic identity and unity of the nation they want to build. Okay? I mean, Brazil has many refugees from Haiti. It is a multiracial, it used to be one of the world's largest multiracial democracies. Now it's an authoritarian neo-fascistic regime. In the United States, the superego of the country, we are a country of immigrants, we are a country of immigrants, but no, we don't want the Mexicans, we don't want the Guatemalans, we don't want the Muslims, we don't want this. These are images of fear that get projected onto the other. And this politics of fear works very well. This is very, very difficult to fight against, but we have to. We have no other choice. We just have to understand the dynamic that the refugee becomes, the migrant in general, becomes the symbol of the other that needs to be extirpated, if you wish, from the body politic. What? In order to achieve some kind of non-existent mythic unity, which really basically means the hegemony of one group.
Thank you. Okay, I will ask two questions now from our audience. One is from Yazan Dogen, who is an assistant professor in anthropology at LSE. So the question is, at the beginning of your talk, you mentioned the deterritorialization of capital and the financialization of economies as part of the neoliberal restructuring of the world. One could also add that this financialization is, in fact, at the heart of the kind of problems you're trying to address. In a sense, the reluctance of states to admit refugees is usually made in the name of protecting the economic well-being of the nation. A moral imperative, if you like, that is at odds with hospitality. Don't you think that pointing out the fictitious distinction between economic migrants and refugees is actually central to the critique you're trying to make and should not be so easily brushed aside? In other words, should not any rethinking of the 1951 Convention require getting rid of the distinction between human rights and social justice altogether? Why keep social justice and human rights apart as two distinct frameworks? And the second question I want to raise is by Irene Chen, who is the UNHCR consultant's global advisor on LGBTQ plus refugee protection. This person is asking, what principles would you advise international humanitarian practitioners to keep in mind to balance state sovereignty, subnational agency, and international human rights norms? How could the 1951 Convention and 1967 Protocol be updated to ensure public accountability? So let's take these two questions. They're huge.
Oh, they are huge and difficult. They're somewhat related. Why want to still distinguish the human rights and social justice frameworks? Or I can also put it in this way: what in fact is the relationship between the human rights framework of the 51 Convention and what is also called global distributive or global redistributive justice? There is now a significant movement among post-colonial theorists who work on refugee issues to begin to question nations' right to exclude. The right to exclude. And this is rattling at one of the chief pillars of sovereignty. And I think that this goes in very well with this perspective that I'm trying to develop against an ontology of containment, an ontology of interdependence. But the pillar of jurisdictional territoriality, as Ms. Chan knows very well, it's very, very unlikely. Even if it is a normative fiction, it will remain as a normative fiction, I'm afraid. However, once we move towards an ontology of interdependence, let me try to explain how I'm thinking about this. Let's take the case of the European Union. The UK is an in and out, you're probably now out, but what exactly is happening between Africa and be it Spain and Africa and Italy, okay? The defensive language is, there are traffickers, they are exploiting the poor refugees and so on. We have to put it in the context of also growing desertification in Africa, okay? We have to ask ourselves how protective measures of the European Union, let's say France protecting its own agriculture, has impacted certain kind of developments within Africa itself. there are studies about cotton growers, right?
Mm-hmm.
Within the United States, in the case of the United States, we cannot understand the movement of people from what is called the Northern Triangle to the United States without understanding at least two things. First of all, these states are narco states, very often built by the US police and military over the years in order to stop drug production and transportation, okay? So the United States bears a certain responsibility for building up a narco state, and many of the gangs in these countries are themselves state paramilitaries. Again, this is not a mystery, it's out there. The second thing is the failure of coffee crop under changing climatic conditions. So when people come to us, and here I'm supporting the social justice argument, when people come and knock on the door, it's happening not because, you know, they are this or that, and it's happening also because of these wider questions of socioeconomic interdependence. Okay, isn't this then an argument? Just scrap the human rights, you know, document and so on. No, I think we need to understand their fundamental interrelationship without wanting to reduce one to the other. Human rights guarantee due process, equality under the law, habeas corpus, a right to counsel. Yeah, they are about the relationship to power and to accountability. We need to have them both. I don't see an either or here at all. I don't see an either or. And I'm saying, since we do have these very strong human rights instruments, let us keep them, let us build on them, while analytically, as social researchers, legal analysts, we have to think about the refugee problem, not just as a problem of persecution, which it is. Right? I mean, the South American refugees, these women are raped, their children are forced to go into gangs, they are coerced, they are beaten, so these are also these are human rights violations. So, okay. The second question is from Ms. Chan. It's a very difficult one, and I mean, there are so many dimensions of it, because there is the question of LGBTQ rights that has been raised, and then there is the question of sub-national agency, which I don't think is quite the same issue. And you know, I think at the level of LGBTQ rights, I think we just have to keep pushing the legal instruments of the convention, maybe even to the breaking point. I mean, I want to acknowledge here the work of James Hathaway, Michelle Foster, who's at Oxford, Hathaway, who's at the University of Michigan. I mean, there's been tremendous work done here to bring up the very concept, to interrelate the concept of a well-founded fear and LGBTQ harms to individuals. I find the question of subnational agencies fascinating, because I think, as we know, the greatest burden of refugee reception falls on localities. This is always one of the ironies. Borders are controlled nationally or transnationally, but refugees live in the locality because the human body is situated somewhere. Okay? And this goes a little bit also to the question of political cost that the first had raised. I am a great believer in strengthening regions because I believe these kinds of issues can only really be solved regionally with the help of transnational umbrella organizations. So I don't know how, maybe I shall stop there and appreciate both questions, very difficult issues.
Yeah. Thank you. I'll raise two more questions, and that will be the final questions for your reflections.
You can tell me the rest. I can't promise that I'll have time to answer everything.
They're long.
They're long. Of my teaching, but I'd like to see what the questions were.
Yes, I think I can read out two more. One is from Angela Naimo from the United States. Do you see the US as a punitive democracy, as Nicole Fleetwood and other critics of the US carceral state describe it? If punishment and policing have been a main response to refugee movements, intrastate and internationally, should we continue calling for state accountability? And another question is from another colleague from the US, Anita Starosta. She says, is it possible to trace connections between the end of the rights of man and the end of the Refugee Convention? If so, are the two continuous? And do they mark different moments, different paradigms, or are they perhaps overlapping? And I raise this question because you address Arendt in your article and actually address aspects of this question that people might be interested in to hear. I'll read one more question then. What can the framework for refugee, this is from Kalyani Yeola, what can the framework for refugees coming out of forcible occupation of nations such as Tibet, Hong Kong, etc., by countries like China? Do the governments in exile establish, can they really work? Is it an example of borderless or stateless government? Yes, I think that those will take our 8 minutes. Apologies to the rest of the audience for not being able to address.
You will send them.
Yes, we'll have a record of the questions. Yes.
Thank you very much. Let me just maybe say something somewhat brief about the first and the third, and I know the second could be a little longer. Is the United States developing towards a punitive democracy? Yes, the concept of the carceral state, I think, is becoming more and more generalized, and in a way, it is extending almost beyond what Foucault saw in our times. And one of the most important things, if there is to be a democracy that we can live under and live by, is going to have to put an end to it. Very briefly, what has happened under Trump in particular is a buildup of the Customs and Border Patrol Office. And if you are a United States resident citizen, keep your eyes on the development of the CBP and ICE, Immigration Customs Enforcement, because these forces are neither police nor the army. It is unclear what ethical rules they stand under, what kind of rules of engagement they stay under. And there was one point during the Seattle riots or confrontations in May where a certain group of the CBP were sent, and the Department of Homeland Security, Chad Wolf, was saying that he had the authorization that he could send more. Okay, so this is one of the brilliant points that Hannah Arendt saw. Unavoidable not to talk about her when she talked about how the Vietnam War came to the United States by causing a kind of illegality and criminalizing the spread of criminality within the government. That is to say, wars, imperialist wars, always take their toll on the body politic as well. Control at the border seeps into control in the homeland. It just there's a sociological rule, and history shows it to us. Before going to Hannah Arendt, I don't quite know really what to say about the question concerning Tibet and Hong Kong. There is an honorable tradition of government in exiles. This goes back quite a bit in history, and individuals engaged in these kinds of oppositions are convention refugees if they can prove their case in the strict sense of the term. The end of human rights. This is no, we're not at the end of human rights. Quite to the contrary. Now more than ever, where we have a chance with the change of the administration in the United States that will have some implications for authoritarian regimes all across the world. This is not the end time of human rights. The end time of human rights, it's a long question, and I've written about it. I think the most legitimate critique there was the critique against the misuse of human rights in the name of humanitarian interventions. I think that critique is valid, and we have to watch against it, but I think truly it is irresponsible of intellectuals, whatever paradoxes and difficulties human rights may have, to speak of an end time of human rights. If anything, right now we have a chance. We have a chance to push against the threat of fascism. And of course, without neglecting in any way social justice issues. So, of course, the dilemmas of the 51 Convention are very much related to this mood, maybe in so many intellectual circles that we seem to be tired. 70 years have passed. UDHR, what have we achieved? Okay. I understand this, but as I said in my first question, I mean, the 51 Convention appeals to one of the most fundamental anthropological practices also in human communities. Okay. That of hospitality, which is also the foundation of interconnectedness in the world.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe we should end on that anthropological note. Thank you very much, Professor Benhabib, for a fantastic lecture and very stimulating discussion. I felt like we were just getting started to get into some deeper issues, but that's the fate of timed conversations. So thank you very much to Professor Benhabib. Thank you very much also to our audience members. And we'll be together next year in the next year's Human Rights Day lecture. So have a good evening.
Thank you, my pleasure.